Good evening, everyone. My name is Jean James, and I'm president of the Canberra Jung Society. Thank you for joining us again. We've had successful gatherings recently, here and online. But this time, we're doing it both ways. This evening, we're delighted to welcome our very own Dr. Richard Barz, speaking about Carl Jung's concept of archetypes and Australian Aboriginal rock art. We've seen some Aboriginal rock art normally accessible from Canberra. Unfortunately, a Yankee Hat site is currently closed due to bushfire damage, so we're not going to visit this site tomorrow as planned. Sadly, the wealth of Aboriginal art is generally ignored, and where recognised is considered enigmatic, even when found interesting or attractive. Academic explanations are available, but can satisfactorily answer only questions of date and style. Cultural interpretations are either lost or restricted to traditional law. Dr. Richard Barz is a retired member of the School of Culture, History and Language at ANU. Since accompanying 1974 expeditions to record traditional sites, he has been fascinated by Aboriginal culture and has spent the last decade photographing the rock art associated with it. Richard will talk for an hour and will break for 15 minutes for tea and coffee. Then resume with questions and discussions and finish by 10 p.m. And we'll be recording this session, and we ask the people that are in recording to be muted while Richard is speaking to avoid any background noise. You can always make comments using the Zoom chat button. So Richard, we'll hand you over to Richard. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Jean. Thank you very much. Okay, it's really, I feel so happy today because it's such a nice day. And I really like warm weather like this. A warmish weather, anyway, first of the time. Well, we're really fortunate here in Canberra and in southeastern Australia, but Canberra is only 90 minutes drive from this spot in Meringue National Park to the Yankee Hat rock art site. And then in Sydney, there's more than 2,000, but maybe you could say around 2,000 rock art sites that one can actually reach. So it's a real trove of Aboriginal rock art. In Canberra, in the Meringue National Park, there are rock paintings. In Sydney, there are paintings, but also rock engravings. So all kinds of rock art are there. And it's a wonderful way, really, to establish a connection with our Aboriginal past, to examine these sites. Well, could I have the first picture, please? Now, in Sydney, there is a very interesting bit of rock art. It's a large shark. It's sometimes called a whale, but it's actually a shark. Now, that's what it looks like. It's just off, it's on Mackenzie's Point on the walking track between Bondi Beach and Bronte Beach. And that's what it looks like when you look at it. And now, can I see the next one, please? And I've outlined the picture in white ink. So, of course, I didn't outline the actual shark, but you can see it this way. You can see it this way. And you can see, I don't know why people call it a whale, because it's got gills, eyes, gills, and it's a whale shark, which of course is still a shark. Anyway, it's right there by that track. I'll say a few things about the rock art, the engraving first. Now, you notice, one thing you notice right away, here's his head, and then his fin over there, and you can see that that's actually, as part of it's fallen away. So this is a very this is not something that's going to last forever. And that's true of rock art in general in Australia. It's always very fragile. It's, you know, it's something that we don't know how long we'll have. Many of them. The cliff is being eaten away, and of course, eventually it'll be many centuries, I hope, but eventually the shark will be gone. Now, a couple of things I'd like to bring out of it. You notice it's got a little fish in its stomach, and that's a very common motif in Aboriginal rock engravings, especially, is to have a large shark or whale, and then in it you'll find can be a fish or several fish, it can be a stingray, it can be a man or a woman. So you find that very often in Aboriginal art. And of course, it makes you think right away of Jonah and being swallowed by the large fish. So it's not something that's not known in other parts of the world. Or in India, there's the Hindu god Vishnu. And Vishnu is also a fish, as an incarnation as a fish. And in Hindu iconography, he's shown coming out of the mouth of the fish. So this idea of a person or a thing being swallowed by a big fish, we find in Aboriginal art, we also find in the rest of the world. The other thing that is especially Aboriginal is, you see it's got a belt across its middle. And again, you find that, I'll point that out in some other rock art I'll be talking about. It's a human hair belt. And it's very important in Aboriginal ceremonial regalia to have a human hair belt, which I know in some dances you stick something in the back, and if you want to be a dingo, say, then it's got some kind of branch or something like that through the hair belt to give the dingo effect. And it has other meanings, which I don't know. They're meanings that would be known only people in that tradition. But the fact that this shark has got a belt, I think it means that it's not just a shark, but it's also a mythical creature or a spirit creature or something like that. And no doubt there's a story to go along with this idea of the shark and swallowing fish. But of course, that's lost. Now, the next picture, please. Now, as I mentioned, this is a really popular walking track, and maybe everybody here has been along it. In the summertime, there's a constant stream of people walking there, and the shark is right over here. And even if I'm taking a photograph of the shark, I never had anyone stop and say, "What are you taking a picture of?" Or no one's ever seemed to notice it. People just don't seem to see it. Now, it's not that surprising that they don't, because as you saw in the first picture, the shark isn't, it's not something in neon. It's not terribly apparent, but it is there, and it is big. And I think that, it makes you think, are people really not interested in Aboriginal art, or do they just not realize it's there? Now, it was in the past, and you think, well, if only there was more publicity, if only people had the location spelled out so they could go and see these things. And you think maybe it'd be better then if people would know about it. Well, yes and no. Yes and no. It's not so long ago. In fact, in the last few decades of the last century, into the first years of this millennium, it was better. They were better marked. In the Sydney and Blue Mountains, street atlas, the guide to the streets, for example, Aboriginal rock art sites are marked. And on the roads, on streets and roads, they would in the past, there'd be a sign saying there's an Aboriginal painting that way. Well, that's fine, but unfortunately it had the bad effect that those people who unfortunately are negative about it, they did some unpleasant things. And I'll show you, for example, one thing that happened. there's a cave site in this picture, a cave site called Bull Cave. And it's located in a suburb, well, in some remnant bushland in the Campbelltown suburb. It's there under a big overhang. It's more of an overhang. It's what you call a rock shelter in archaeological terms. And it was first described, I guess you'd say, first scientifically described in 1971. There was a group who went there. It was originally, it was a rock art site with lots of rock paintings. There are paintings on engravings. And it was a meeting point, evidently, of three groups, the Darug and Kangaroo peoples seem to have met there, or have said, according to their own traditions, that they met there, and this was a sacred site. Well, in 1971, it was examined scientifically, and in this rock shelter, there are not only Aboriginal paintings like hand stencils and drawings, but there were two very big charcoal and red pigment drawings of a bull and a cow. And of course, bulls and cows weren't known in Australia until 1788. So you ask yourself, how did it happen that they were here? I should say that when it was examined scientifically, it was determined that definitely they were Aboriginal drawings. You know, it wasn't just some European, Australian person drew a bull and a cow, but they were the stylistic Aboriginal drawings. And they had to be, it was thought, before 1820 in date, because after 1820, European settlement dispossessed the Aboriginal people living there, including there was a really vicious massacre that took place. So the Aboriginal population was dispersed. So it was assumed it was painted before that. Now, how did it happen? Well, in 1788, on the first fleet stopped in South Africa, and they took on one bull, 5 cows, and 1 bull calf to bring to the first settlement. And they did that, and these cattle were released on the domain, on Sydney Domain, as pasture. And they escaped into the bush. Well, for 7 years, they weren't seen until 7 years later, 2 convicts came upon a herd of wild cattle, and they were the descendants of those escaped beasts that had got away. And some Aboriginal person, a man or a woman, had drawn these very exotic animals on that cave or rock shelter in the back. And of course, this was considered a very, very, very important thing, because that was the first case and the only known case of Aboriginal people making a drawing of the first cattle brought to Australia. Well, that was very important. Very, 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 very unfortunately, next picture please, it was not just the scientists who found out about it, but it was vandalized, really badly vandalized. You can see, this is inside the cave. You can see there still are some Aboriginal things there. There's handprints. There's 1, there's 2, there's 1 over there in red and white. But it's been terribly defaced by idiots, you know. And they tried to save this from happening further by putting that steel mesh guard over the front that you saw in the previous picture. But it didn't help, because with spray paint, people came and they did even more damage. Now, I went there in 2017, and it's said, when you read about it, and there is a site on the internet, which I can give anyone interested, on Bull Cave. So you can just put in Bull Cave on your search engine, and you'll get the full story about this. But the problem remains. Anyway, they say, it's said on this side, for example, that you can still see the bull, not the cow, but the bull is still visible. I couldn't see it. I just couldn't see it. So maybe it depends on the time of day. I hope it's still there, but it doesn't look to me anyway very promising. Well, that shows that while Aboriginal rock art should be, yes, we should be publicized all right, but it should also be protected. And that brings up the policy, which you find, there's a policy now of officialdom with the cooperation and with the advice of Aboriginal groups. And there's a policy of what you call concealment, excising from public awareness these sites, but selectively revealing a few. So I'll give an example. So no longer will you find in any street atlas any Aboriginal sites marked, and you don't find them on the road unless it's a particular one. Now, for instance, in the ACT at Namadgi National Park, there are actually 3 rock art sites, rock painting sites, not just Yankee Hat, but there's 2 others. But no longer are they mentioned in any Namadgi National Park literature. And this is a decision of the Namadgi National Park management and also the Ngambri people who are the custodians of the park. So the idea is you don't tell people about the other sides, and you try to funnel people to the ones that you can protect and you guard. Now you can still go to the other sides. You can still go to forbidden development. But the trouble is that you've got to do some pretty good research in the academic literature to find out where they are. And then you've got to be willing to do some serious bush bashing to find them, because the pathways have been obliterated, actually. So you need to do some pretty serious work. You can find them, they're there, and they're very interesting, but not just everybody is going to go there, so it'll be safe and that kind of thing. Among the states of Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia seem to follow the same, concealment and selective revelation of a few sites. That seems to be the policy in all 3 of those states, like the ACT. In Queensland and the Northern Territory, they have the same thing, concealment and revelation of a few sites, but also the added bit that they give Aboriginal groups who do have, for whom it is part of their living tradition, they have custodianship over the sites that are on their land. So there's the 2 ways. There's the official, control, and then there's the Aboriginal group controlling their sites. Now Tasmania, very interesting. Tasmania just conceals the sites, but Aboriginal groups in Tasmania are given control over sites, but as you can imagine, it's sometimes quite difficult to get permission to go on those lands. So, Tasmania is kind of, it's very careful, I guess you'd say, with the sites that they have there. In Western Australia, unfortunately, it seems that mining companies have the final say. I've been hearing about that lately. So I hope that they will change their policy in the future. Well, I agree wholeheartedly with this policy of selective revelation of these sites. Okay, now when you go to an Aboriginal rock art or rock engraving site, of course you want to know. Well, 3 things, I think. Three questions occurred to me anyway. I suppose to everyone. You want to know how old are they, and you want to know what do they mean, and then you want to know what relevance do they have for people today. Well, as far as age is concerned, it's very hard to date Aboriginal rock art sites. For example, very famous archaeologist Josephine Flood, who was with the Australian Heritage Commission at the time, she carried out excavations at Yankee Hat, at the Yankee Hat site in Namaji National Park, the site that's now closed because of the bushfire damage. But normally it's open to the public, and the Park Service wants you to go there to that site. Okay? Yankee Hat, you can kind of see why it's called Yankee Hat. It's got two peaks, and there's a crease down there. And it's supposed to be like, you know, those old-fashioned cowboy hats, like cowboy actors of the 30s, and they wore this Kangaroo hats with the crease down there. So that's why it's called Yankee Hat. The Yankee Hat art site is down here. And Josephine Flood did an excavation at the Yankee Hat art site. Maybe we see the next picture. And she found that in her earliest layers, the furthest, I think 50 centimeters down, which was below that, it was sterile soil. So that was the lowest level of habitation. There was charcoal, and she had that charcoal radiocarbon dated, and it was dated to 700 years ago. So you can say that there's a settlement at Yankee Hat, and you can see the drawings I'll talk about in a minute. But so settlement there was 700 years ago. But of course, it tells you nothing at all about the art. So people might have lived there 700 years ago at the base of this wall. But when did they paint it, you know? Maybe they painted it before that, and nobody was living there. Maybe they painted it sometime after, you just don't know. It just tells you when the settlement was, not when the painting was done. And when you look at Aboriginal art paintings that are engravings that are part of the living tradition, you see that actually, first of all, the meaning is layered. So if it's part of a living tradition, it's very unlikely a man or woman of that tradition will tell anyone the deepest layer of meaning who isn't initiated, who isn't properly initiated. So there's that bit. But also in terms of dating, it's they constantly are adding to them, constantly changing them. So, you know, it's a kind of a work in progress. It's part of the living tradition. So that makes it very hard to come to any dates. It's specialists in Aboriginal rock art try to date relatively by, you know, finding out, well, which ones are overlying, like I think in these sculptures, I remember that the red figure is overlaying the white ones. You know, you can see that kind of thing. And you can talk about stylistic changes. You can analyze the pigments and try to work out some kind of dating from that. But it's all very, very, very kind of uncertain, you'd have to say. Okay, so there is, however, one site in southeastern Australia that can be dated pretty much precisely. And that you find at the corner of Ellaroo Street and Adina Street, or avenues rather, Ellaroo and Adina avenues in the Sydney suburb of La Perouse. And there is an Aboriginal mission church in the background. And it's interesting that this La Perouse settlement is the only place in Sydney where Aboriginal people have actually lived in one spot since contact. So the La Perouse community is very, very, very old. It also has strong ties with people on the south coast, like Wreck Bay. Wreck Bay and the ACT territory in the Jarvis Bay. They have this contact that's ongoing with the Aboriginal people. But it's got a church, a mission church, and it's got a mass. Now, it's all being restored or as a historical site. The church is being repaired. I don't know what they're doing with the mass. Maybe they're even tearing it down, I just don't know. It was built in the 30s, so maybe it's not considered to be important. And then the rock art site I'm about to talk about is here behind this plastic fencing. And well, I'll say a few things about that. Now, when I say it's dated precisely, by the memory of eyewitnesses, it was engraved in the year 1931. So you can say about the rock art, and we better show the picture, I guess, that it's done in 1931. Now, it's a man, he's got a boomerang in his left hand, he's facing it, and the spear, I get confused now, yeah, he's got his spear in his right hand, I guess, and the boomerang in his left hand, maybe the other way around, I'm turned around now. But let's see the next picture, and we'll see it outlined. There it is outlined widely so you can see it better. Now, it is supposedly by memory done, as I say, in 1931. It's even known who did it, who the artists were who did it. It was Bert Tambar, Bob Sims, and Jack Sims. All three were members of the Vaporous community. And, you know, they did the painting, the engraving, and people saw it. Now, it is stylistically definitely an Aboriginal painting, so it's quite late, of course, but it's, it has links with the same theme in pre-contact or pre-European contact. Aboriginal engravings, there's no doubt that it is really an Aboriginal engraving. It's done in the traditional style. What you did is you took a sharp stone and kept the outline, and then you chip away the bits between the pickings. So that's how they did those figures, and this is done in that way.
It looks very European, doesn't it?
Well, you see, there's two things that are. I might see the next picture because the next picture is the kangaroo. It's a man who's steering a kangaroo, and that's how it looks. Now we better look at it outline. Next picture, yeah. There we go. Yeah, the kangaroos looking back like that. I haven't seen any kangaroo in an engraving quite like that. So I would call that probably because Bob Tamper, Jack Sim, and was it Bob Sim, I think. They were, of course, brought up in a culture by that time that was European. So yes, I think that is a European influence. Another possible influence on the other picture is the fact that the man is no penis, but in all Aboriginal art, male figures, they almost always have a penis. So, you know, there's a kind of prudery had come in by that time. But otherwise, you find many rock art engraving sites in which there's a man facing like this with a spear in one hand, and often a boomerang in the other, steering a kangaroo. So the theme is definitely something that's ancient or it's pre-European. Now, the reason why it was done, or the question of meaning, arises next. Now, the significance of Aboriginal art, of course, to those who are in a living tradition, no doubt, you know, they have, that's part of their tradition, so there's that significance, which is here today too. Another kind of meaning, though, would be, well, why, you know, there's been such disruption and such dislocation that, well, before I get into that, I should say the La Perouse side, again, it does have, we know the meaning of that side, or kind of we do. I should say that first. Because the same people that saw it being carved also said what it meant. And according to them, according to eyewitnesses, it was done to commemorate the expected opening of the Sydney Harbour Bridge in March 1932. And of course you say to yourself, well, you know, maybe so, but a man spearing a kangaroo doesn't have any obvious connection with the bridge being built. And you wonder, don't you? You wonder if it isn't very possible that really those three people who did this carving, if they had another significance in mind, a more traditional significance, which, given the fact that it's on the grounds of a church, and the time being the 30s, that they just left it unstated. So there may be another meaning there, but we don't know what it is. Now, on that line, When you're looking for meaning in rock art and rock painting here, you have to bear in mind that there's been tremendous cultural dislocation. And another picture, please. Next one. And this is said in a sign, and you find these signs at many rock art sites in southeastern Australia. And this is a sign by, it gives the words, it's at the Yidonba Aboriginal Cultural Site in Chiltern Mount Pilot National Park near Beechworth in northeastern Victoria. These are the words of an Aboriginal elder of that area. And he says, these rocks have heard voices over thousands of years. Sometimes in the past, our ancestors visited here and chose to paint on the rocks. We're not sure exactly why they made paintings here. Knowledge about this side was disrupted by settlers and by the gold rush. Now, we believe the paintings were made to teach people about the culture. They are important parts, important to our community because they remind us that our people were here a long time ago. So I guess what that says is that the religious or spiritual meaning of the sites have pretty much been lost. If there are cases where they're not lost, I don't think anybody in the tradition that's still alive would want to tell exactly what it means because of the nature of Aboriginal religion. Now, when you come to the relevance of Aboriginal rock art for contemporary life, all right, it seems to me that there are 4 answers to this question. First, for anyone who is associated with an Aboriginal group, the art is part of the ongoing development of their culture. So that's fine. That's one thing that makes it relevant. And several times while visiting Aboriginal art site in southeastern Australia, I've come upon remains of little fires. Now, does that mean that someone is coming there and conducting a ceremony in that place? Or is it just the residue of a picnic? Of course, there's no way to know. But it does hint that maybe there is some ongoing life in some places of these. And second, there's the humanistic, you might say the humanistic relevance. It's the next picture. Now, because the works, and this one is at, on West Head in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park. It's on the Basin track, and it's completely open to the public. I should say that everything I'm talking about, all of these sites are open and available to anybody who wants to go to them. They're the sites that are revealed. They're not ones that are secret, with 2 exceptions. One was that Bull Cave site. That's, no one is encouraged to go there. And another one I'll talk about is also like that. But these are quite open, and they're very nicely set up with the boardwalk and explanatory signs. So everything is there for anyone who wants to see them. Now, I think that this impresses me, whatever else it means, because certainly it means other things which we don't know. But at least this you can get out of it. You can get a feeling for a contact over centuries, who knows how long, but certainly a great cultural contact with people we met before. Because the creators of the rock art are creating things often from their ordinary lives. So here you've got a man, and you can see his, he's got either a headdress of some kind or a hairdo of some sort. As I said, there's always penises, so there's one there. He's holding in this hand, which you can't see very well. It's a boomerang. He's holding a boomerang in that hand. In the other hand, you have to take my word for it, he's holding fish. But because of the curvature of the rock, I couldn't get that. I couldn't get the whole thing in with the fish there. And of course, because there's a barrier, you can't go walking out over there and take a better picture. So just believe me, he does have a fish in that hand. On this side of his right armpit, he's got belly bag, you can see there, and he's got what's interpreted as a fishing line. So this is a man who is evidently in fishing and hunting. He's got a boomerang, and he's got his fish there. And then beside him is a woman, and she has got a cooler. So she's been out collecting roots and berries and things. And you can see, you know, this is like fishing and shopping, whether it's in the supermarket or the bush. It's something that you know you can kind of feel an identity with those people in a lot of cases like that. Now this figure, it's uncertain whether it's male or female. This figure here is not part, it's thought, it's not part of that group, but it's part of another group. The interesting thing about this one, I'd like to point out, is there's that hair belt that I mentioned that the shark was wearing in Mackenzie's Point. And here you see again hair belt on that figure. Now, might say the third way to see these paintings as relevant for today is just plain as art. And there's so many places in southeastern Australia. There's Carnarvon Gorge in Queensland. There's the Grampians in Victoria, has a very good, wonderful collection of rock art, rock paintings mostly, and many other places. This is rock paintings near Laura in Queensland, on halfway up the Cape York Peninsula. And the Laura site is in the control of a local Aboriginal organization. So if you go there, it's really worth going there. If you go there, you can take a self-guided tour. But if you want to get these, you have to go with a guide from that organization. And it's well worth it. Well, anyway, I think as art, that's fine art, you know, by anyone's standard. So you can see many Aboriginal engravings and paintings, not all of them, but many of them you can see as art, just to enjoy it as art. These are Quincan figures. There were Quincan were a spirit, a kind of spirit, and that's a male Quincan, there's a female Quincan, and there are lots of stories and myths about Quincan that are still living things that still people know. Well, the fourth answer to the question of relevance of rock art and rock paintings is at last getting to Jung. Carl Gustav Jung had in his it's the volume 9, part 1 of his collected works, in which he talks about, especially about the archetypes. Now, he has 3 definitions of an archetype, which I think fit really well with Aboriginal rock paintings and engravings. The first one is the archetype is always an image belonging to the whole human race and not merely to the individual. So for Jung, an archetype is universal, you know, through all times and all cultures. The second quote is from Jung. For the archetype is an element of our psychic structure and thus a vital and necessary component in our psychic economy. It represents or personifies certain instinctive data of the dark, primitive psyche, the real but invisible roots of consciousness. So it's universal, but it's also very individual. So it's something that every person can feel at the roots of their consciousness. And finally, the last quote from Jung, from the same book, the archetype has a potential existence only. And when it takes shape and matter, it is no longer what it was. It persists through the ages and requires interpreting ever anew. The archetypes are the imperishable elements of the unconscious, but they change their shape continually. So the archetypes are universal, they're individual, but you can't say that they have a definite meaning, but they have to be constantly reinterpreted through time. So I take Jung's description of the archetype to indicate that the modern observer of Aboriginal rock art, or paintings, engravings, can see and feel in them archetypes that have a fresh and immediate impact on the observer's psyche. Now, before applying Jung's description of the archetypes to a work of Aboriginal art, I'd like to take a look at something more familiar, like a painting in the European Australian tradition, and look at an archetype there to kind of get into the pattern before we go to Aboriginal art. So next picture, please. Well, such a painting is in the National Gallery here in Canberra. This is a painting called Mrs. Adolphus Scales with Black Jimmy on Meringue Station. It was done in 1856 by Robert Dowling, who lived from 1827 to 1886. Now you can look at that, of course you just see a landowning woman. There's a landowning woman. She's clad in black because she's recently a widow. Her name, by the way, is Jane Scales. And she has chosen to have in her portrait scene her groom, Aboriginal groom, Jimmy, and her 2 horses and 2 dogs. Okay? But I think that Robert Dowling, the artist, has hinted at something deeper than that when he painted the picture, because if you look at those clouds, to me they're a bit surreal, and the trees also, and the buildings over there. So I think he was telling the perceptive viewer there's something more in this than just what seems to be there. And if you look at it in terms of archetypes, I think that might not Jane Scales, whether she's staring or gazing off into the distance beyond Jimmy. Is she the archetypal woman? Is Jimmy's staring out past us, the observers out here? Is he the archetypal man? Would it be too much to say that Jane and Jimmy are an animus in Jungian terms? And then you've got the 2 horses. They're held, reined in by Jimmy on one end, Jane on the other. They look like archetypal horses to me. And the dogs, one dog is looking at Jimmy and one's looking at Jane. I think, to me, they're archetypal dogs. Well, are they archetypes? They are, if they're at the roots of the observer's consciousness. Well, this is about Aboriginal rock art, not about European, Australian art, so better move on to an Aboriginal example. Okay, I find a very good example of the archetypal element in Aboriginal art in a painting found within a grotto within a gigantic boulder, at Bunjil's Cave Heritage Site near Stawell in southwestern Victoria. Now, Bunjil or Bunjil, the way U was written in the 19th century to indicate either an up or an up, makes it uncertain, but I'll say in a minute that some of the Aboriginal words from which this is derived pronounce with an up or an up. I'm just going to say Bunjil now. But this portrays Bunjil, and Bunjil, oh, that's the side. No, the next one, look at Bunjil. Yeah, this portrays Bunjil. This is the only portrayal of Bunjil in rock art, by the way, in Australia. It shows him sitting cross-legged with his hands on his hips. He's got that belt around his waist like that. He's got body decorations. You can see his head there and his eyes. And it is unusual to have an Aboriginal rock painting, rock engraving with the figure sitting cross-legged. He's got 2 dingoes. There's one dingo is looking at him. The other dingo is looking away. And remind you of those 2 dogs in the Dowling picture. One's looking at the subject, the other's looking away. Or in the case of those dogs, one is looking at one subject and the other at the other. Okay, now the belt reminds you of the Mackenzie's Point shark and the figure at Basin Point, base of the track. Now, according to A.J. Howard, and A.J. Howard is very important for the history of Aboriginal culture in Australia. He collected and recorded first-hand information about Aboriginal customs and beliefs in southeastern Australia in the period of initial European contact. Now, according to him, according to Howard, Bunjil taught his people the arts of life, and that included the correct way to choose a marriage partner. His son, Bunjil's son, is the rainbow, and he himself became a star in the sky. Some groups said it was formaldehyde in the constellation Viscus Austrinus, and in the opinion of other groups, it was Altair in the constellation Aquila, in the legends of other groups. Now, the okay, now a little bit further insight into Bunjil you get from his name. By the mid-decades of the 20th century, it was thought that Aboriginal languages in Victoria were completely, totally extinct. But my colleague at the ANU, my friend and colleague for many years there, Dr. Louise Hercus, she didn't accept that. And she went out and she found elderly Aboriginal people who still spoke their traditional languages. And she recorded those. Sometimes there was very little to record, sometimes quite a bit. She did that in a 2-volume work called The Languages of Victoria, a late survey published by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies in Canberra. If she hadn't done that, those languages would have been completely lost except for a few word lists. But she did a real linguistic analysis, as she was a professional linguist. Now, she has in her grammars of this language, she also has vocabularies. And according to her, the Wemba Wemba language of North Central Victoria, in that language, Bunjil means a Murray cob. In the speech of the Muddy Muddy, who live in the Western Murray Valley of New South Wales and Victoria, Bunjil is a huge Murray cob. And in Waiwaru, spoken to the north of Melbourne, Bunjil is an eagle hawk or wedge-tailed eagle. So you can see that it has a meaning of something big or something special. And in A.D. Howard's book, there's further information that an expert or learned man would be called Bunjil. So the spirit called Bunjil is not only a kind of an all-spirit, almost a single divinity kind of thing living in the sky, but it's also anything awe-inspiring. Now, whoever painted Bunjil and the 2 dingoes was referring to a myth or a story that's now lost. But to me, ignorant of the myth, the location of the painting in the cave, it's actually, you can see it better in the picture, in the photograph, because I can make it lighter, you know. When you look at it, it's actually quite dark in here. It evokes an archetypal message in which the Bunjil figure can be an archetypal human being, because it's not obviously, there's no representation of any sexual characteristic, and he's accompanied by those 2 archetypal dogs. Now, Howard was the first one to mention the paintings of Bunjil and the dogs in Bunjil's cave in his book, which was published in 1904, republished in 1996. And he says, one of the Mukjarawant was an Aboriginal group, one of the Mukjarawant said that at one time there was a figure of Bunjil and his dog painted in a small cave behind a large rock in the Black Range near Stowe. But I have not seen it, nor have I heard of anyone having seen it. Okay? The subsequent history of the Bunjil Caves painting provides an example of the vicissitudes of Aboriginal rock art in Australia. Historians and anthropologists in Victoria were intrigued by Howard's reference to the Bunjil painting. Remember, he did this, published in 1904, but he did research going back to the 1840s. But they made efforts to locate it, and they were unsuccessful. So no one of the academic community could find this painting that Howard referred to. Then in 1957, researchers discovered that Bunjil's cave was quite well known to people living around Stowe. They knew perfectly well where it was. So I just took, asking around the area. As children, some of them said that they had played in the cave. And they were very impressed and fascinated and even a little bit scared of the painting, which they thought was painted by an itinerant swagman. Furthermore, they said that as children, they had touched up the painting. But they stressed that they did not alter the design. Well, you can imagine, talk about touching up naturally aroused suspicions and great controversy about the authenticity of the Bunjil's cave painting erupted among specialists in Victoria. Quite a long, you can read in the literature, there's a lot of things written, pro and con, is it authentic, is it not? Finally, in 1979, Bunjil's cave was removed from the Victoria Archaeological Survey site register. So the people who were in favor of it being fake, or at least not authentic, won out and they had it removed. Now, but the others didn't give it up. One of the key issues, by the way, in this was the fact that Howard, in his book, had said that there was only one dog in the painting, whereas you can see there's two dogs. Okay. Now, further investigations, because the people who thought it was authentic didn't give up. After all, Howard described it at the beginning of European contact, so it wasn't the swagman who painted it, for sure. And that further tests were made, including tests on the pigment. And they discovered that, yes, one of the dingoes, I think this one, that his tail had indeed some European paint, but the rest of it was ochre, was a natural Aboriginal thing. So it's true, the children did kind of touch it up, but it's also true they didn't paint it and they didn't alter it. So these pigment tests and other inquiries caused Bunjil's cave to be reinstated in the Victoria Archaeological Survey site register in 1983. So it was then said to be authentic. In 1984, the figure of Bunjil appeared on an Australian post stamp, so it was definitely admitted into the genuine area. Now later, upon examination of Howard's handwritten, first-hand field notes, his actual notes were preserved in an archive, and some researchers looked at those notes, and they discovered that what Howard had actually said was, this is a quote from the field notes, Bunjil is painted in it and a little dog in each side. So the thing about only one dog was a mistake in the printed book. He had said there were two dogs. Now the location, of course, is not right because the dogs are on the same side. But after all, neither Howard nor his Aboriginal informant, who he identified in his notes as John Carroll, neither one of them had actually been there. They hadn't actually seen it. So it's not surprising that they got a bit mixed up on which side the dogs were on. Unfortunately, over the years, Bunjil's cave was defaced by painted graffiti, including racist comments. The graffiti had been removed, but in some cases by being overpainted in black paint by this is officially by the local council. And unfortunately, they covered a faint human figure drawn in ochre, red ochre, on the side of the boulder outside the cave. So in trying to get rid of the graffiti, they also got rid of part of the art. But actually, Bunjil was safe. And the cave and its art are now protected by that sturdy metal fence you saw in the first one. Now, in closing, I'd like to look at another archetypal figure in a work of Aboriginal rock art. This is a rock engraving off the America Bay track in Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, also in West End. Like the Bull Cave site, which I mentioned earlier, the way to this engraving site is unmarked. You've got to have a pretty good eye to see that there is a faint trail. And if you follow it, you'll find this art, but there's no sign. The engraving matches mythical descriptions of Dharamolan. Now, Dharamolan is said to be part of a continuum, you might say, of a supernatural figure, which was Bunjil in Western Victoria, and then Dharamolan and Bayame is another name in New South Wales. So, so the Dharamolan figure will be similar in its effect to the Bunjil figure I just talked about. Now, I guess we better see the next picture. That's how it looks. And then here's how it's outlined, how the photograph is outlined. There it is. Okay, this is the head. The head is down here, and that's the foot up there. And that's Dharamolan. It matches the description of Dharamolan according to legends. Dharamolan has only 1 foot. He has 1 leg, 1 foot, 1 thigh, 1 leg, 1 foot. His wife is an emu, and often you find emu. Not one, but no, there's several engravings of Dharamolan in the Sydney area. Others will have an emu in close association with him because that's his wife. And he had a role similar, as I say, to Bunjil. He gave the law to those people who accepted it and so on.
How big is that?
But it's quite big. If you were to lie down, then your feet, say, or your head, I guess, and your feet would maybe go up to bed. It's quite long. It's quite a big thing. It's not easy to get a picture of it. I made several attempts to get the whole thing in, and that's the only one that came out. He's also in the sky, like Bunjil. He's, to some groups, he's Alpha Crucis in the Southern Cross constellation. And the rest of the Southern Cross constellation is the head of his emu wife. Now, in he has his back is shaped like an emu, and as I say, he has only 1 leg. Now, in 1873, in an article, William Ridley writes that in the Kamilaroi language, which is spoken in north-central New South Wales, over an extensive region, the word for thigh is Dara, and the word for 1 is Mal. So that Dharamolan, taking on as a suffix, grammatical suffix, Dharamolan would mean the 1 thigh. Well, of course, if you've got 1 thigh, you've also got 1 leg and 1 foot. So that's what his name means. Below, if you look at him, he's got his beak-like mouth, which is open. He's got a feather or a horn on the back of his head. When you go down his body, he's got an arm that comes out with a hand and fingers. He's got his back, arm rolling like that. He's got up there, he's got that hair belt, just like the shark at Mackenzie's Point, the figure in Kurumate Central Park, at Basin Trap, and like Bunjil himself. So he's also got the same kind of thing. Below that is, maybe it's a bladder, could be a bladder, and then looks like a penis going out, and it actually goes further, and there's a pool which fills with water. So it seems to go all the way back. And then you've got a kind of an ankle band around his foot. And then you've got over here an interesting crescent-shaped object, which could be a boomerang, of course, but it's kind of double. It's got a crescent like that, and it's got a line through it. Now, it could be that that is an object that Ridley, the same man who had that word list that gave the meaning of Dharamolan, it could be this what Ridley called the sacred wand. And that wand was known by groups in the Namoy and Barwon River areas in north-central New South Wales, known as Dhurambalam. And Dhurambalam probably is a bull roar. You know, you swing around your head and make an awesome sound. And that bull roar is associated with Dharamolan by many Aboriginal groups. So it seems to me likely that is a bull roar, but you know, all these things are kind of educated guesses because there isn't anyone to say what the tradition really is. Well, it may seem strange that the Ramalan has only one leg. One-leggedness is a feature found in other traditions. For instance, the Hindu deity Shiva. Shiva is sometimes depicted as having only a single leg. Well, I think if Jung had seen this image, he would definitely have a very strong impression of him as an archetype, and it certainly makes that impression on me. Now, for further reading, if anyone's interested in further reading about Aboriginal rock art in southeastern Australia, I would start with A.W. Howard, The Native Tribes of Southeast Australia. It was done originally in 1904. It was republished, reprinted by the Aboriginal Studies Press in Canberra in 1996. It has some of the faults of its time. You know, he thought Aboriginal people were going to die out, like I guess most people who were European did at that time. But he was a really good, honest observer. So you could kind of discount a few of his ideas that were ideas of his time. It's just about the only place you can find a real description from Aboriginal people or from stockmen and people like that in close association about customs. And he goes into great detail. It's a very thick book. For information about Aboriginal rock art in all parts of Australia, I really recommend Josephine Flood for her The Riches of Ancient Australia, published by the University of Queensland, St. Lucia in 1990. She goes through every state and territory in Australia, and she talks about the rock art sites there. She often locates them. So with coordinates, so if you've got a GPS and a good map, you can find them if you want to. But she's a very good source for Aboriginal rock art, both engravings and paintings. And finally, for information about the Aboriginal cultural life and rock art in the Sydney region, a really good book is Val Attenborough, Sydney's Aboriginal Past, Investigating the Archaeological and Historical Research by the University of New South Wales Press in Sydney, and that was published in 2010. It sounds like a very dry title when you look at it, like, you know, archaeological and historical records. That sound very interesting. But actually, it's very interestingly written, and it's not just about records. It really is about the rock art sites around Sydney and about the cultural traditions. She brings together everything that's known and puts them in one place. So it's a very good book to start with. I hope everyone has a nice copy.
Thank you very much, Richard. You've given us so much to think about. I think when a borders control eases up, maybe we can go travelling to these different sites. It'd be quite an amazing journey, wouldn't it? So I'd like to encourage everyone now to have a break of 15 minutes. There's supper and there's drinks in the kitchen. So help yourself and mingle. And then we have a new person here, Matthew at the back. He's just joined up. So that's great. I like people that join up the Jung Society because we need to grow it. So, and young too, that's what we're younger. And of course we're all young at heart, aren't we? Yeah. Anyway, so we'd like to encourage you to mingle and to have some supper. We'll meet in another 15 minutes.
Richard's just confirmed the text of what he's been talking about will be put on the website, including the book references and so forth. So if you want all that followed up on the website, we'll get that there quite soon. Thanks.
I know it's hard. Fridays after. Yeah. We'd like for everyone to come back to the seats with your supper, drinks, as you like. And we'd like Richard to come back to us and tell us some information, or if you have questions for him, please do ask. Thank you.
Yeah.
I always have a question.
Why not?
But, so I mean, the story is the Australian Aboriginal is the oldest living culture
Yeah.
in that respect, and they were distinct in that, like 40, 50 years perhaps. So is there anything there in the symbolisms and the archetypes that is represented that is distinct from other parts, I know there's the universal, they won't be completely universal. As you said, there is always adaptations and variations.
Yeah.
Is there anything distinctive with respect to the Australian?
Well, it's interesting. It's interesting. There's a Michael Wurzel at Harvard University has a theory which is very interesting. I think there's a body of people that follow it. But you know how the idea was that that modern humans came out of Africa about maybe 70, 80,000 years ago to Yemen, and then moved around South Arabia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, over mostly sea, but also land passage to Papua New Guinea and Australia, and then other groups moved up to Europe. According to him, there are definite motifs that he finds in Australian Aboriginal art, and also the art of that southern part of that migration, which is different from, according to him, the more northerly ones. So there's that, and well, yeah, it's something that I've never been quite able to grasp, but he is very convinced, and he has lots of writing about it.
That story you told is now evolved to some extent, because they now think that, well, as well as Homo sapiens,
Yep.
there's also been other
Yep.
hominids
Neanderthal.
that have been included in Neanderthal, and the red cave
Yeah,
people, and the new ones in.
yeah, Denisovian, yeah.
So they're all sort of components of that within the timescale.
Yeah, that's right.
Aboriginal.
And there's even the feeling now that maybe they used to say Neanderthals didn't have the right structure for speech, and now it's thought maybe they did.
Oh yeah, but there's no Neanderthal in the Australian Aboriginal.
No, there's not this, but there is Denisovian evidently
That's
genetic
not right.
links. Yeah.
So does it have any manifestation that you can?
I just can't point to anything, because everything you think of seems to have, seems to have similar things in other cultures. Like one deity, for example, or like swallowing something. I haven't seen anything that I really thought was, uniquely Australian. I'm sure there are. It's just that we've lost so much of the oral tradition.
Richard,
Yeah.
did you finish that?
Yeah, that's all I can say.
I was going to say that the one in La Perouse was done during the Depression.
Mhm.
My grandmother used to always tell me she was born outside of Kangaroo in 1908 and came as a young woman to Sydney to live with relatives, and she stayed in Sydney. And she used to say during the Depression she'd go to the shanty town in La Perouse and take a bag of groceries each weekend.
Yeah.
And I only found out recently that shanty town was an Indigenous one, was it?
Well,
during the Depression?
there was Happy Valley, and there was another one with a number. Have you been to La Perouse recently?
No.
Because the museum, you should go right away, because the museum there has a special exhibit on that area in the Depression and on those Depression settlements. Yeah.
Happy Valley, but I think that the exhibition closed about 3 weeks
Oh,
ago.
did it? Oh, did it?
I'm sure that it was the lovely museum at La Perouse, on the headland of La Perouse. wood structures, sleep and afterwards it remained prominently Aboriginal.
And then in the 50s, evidently, there was a surge of, displaced people from Europe.
That's me.
Were you there?
I have a picture of me at MacKillop Primary in 1954.
Yeah.
All these very smart kids. No, naturally.
Oh, that's really.
Because that was all the,
Yeah.
I was, what was that? An alien. I was displaced
Yeah.
persons camp. And
Repo was one of the words too.
Repo, yeah. I am a repo.
Yeah. Well, I'm an economic refugee. Yeah.
The big monster called Darramalan
Yeah.
has a Catholic high school
Yes, it
named
does.
after
Yeah,
him
that's right.
in
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's an interesting example of cultural syncretism,
It is.
because like traditionally the Catholic Church was quite hostile to non-Christian religious iconography, but to use Darramalan as a name of a school, have you looked at all into that?
Well, I haven't ever, I've looked on the website,
Yeah.
and I haven't ever talked with anyone there. But, it's not a Jesuit school, is it?
I don't know.
Because, you think right away, oh, the Jesuits are quite famous for incorporating indigenous things into their missionary work, like, India, where they incorporate dances and things, and also in Mexico, where they did incorporate ceremonies and things from indigenous culture. So I just wondered if maybe Darramalan College was somehow, if at some point Catholic missionaries in working with Aboriginal groups had, maybe they called God Darramalan or something like that. But I'd like to talk with someone. Do you know anyone at school? Yeah, I'd very much like to know how that got that name.
And with the rock art, it's all exposed to the weather. And so, I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, there's a rock art site at Bondi Golf Course. Where
Right.
Bondi, at the north end of Bondi Beach, there's a golf course. And it's got a really good collection of rock art there. And that was regrouped by the Waverley Council in the 60s. So that's one thing. Now that's completely condemned nowadays, by specialists. But then you think, yeah, but on the other hand, they're going to wear away if someone doesn't do something about it. And you wonder if maybe that isn't, so maybe Aboriginal people could do it, but if that isn't the answer. Because I know some of the rock art sites at near French's Forest, really they're hard to see now, really hard. And often you have to go in the early morning or the late evening to get the slanted sun to come in.
I visited some rock art in Mookamurra Reserve up near the Hawkesbury River.
Yeah.
And a lot of the pieces that we went to see were covered by debris.
Yeah.
And just gum leaves and leaf litter.
Yeah.
And you can see that they were gradually being reconsumed. So the whole question of whether they should be viewed as artistic heritage, and when you look at how European paintings are preserved so assiduously, to just leave, and I think one of the issues is that the cultural genocide has been so extensive in Australia, as you were alluding, with the complete loss of the languages of Victoria. I mean, that's astounding, just how comprehensive that linguistic genocide was in Australia. And so, finding anything from pre-white days and preserving it, I would have thought, like, you could even think about a case for moving significant rock art pieces into a place where they're preserved from the rain and wind.
Well, it's interesting. In Tasmania, there's a rock art site on the west coast, up towards the north end of the west coast. There's a rock art site there. Tasmanian rock art is generally extremely simple. you know, it'll be just circles and lines mostly. But in the late 60s, the Tasmanian Museum went there and they actually cut away a big chunk of it and moved it to the Tasmanian Museum in Hobart. And there they displayed it. Well, it's still there, but now it's in the basement. And if you want to see it, you have to write or call in advance because, you know, they're terribly worried that Aboriginal groups will really be angry about it if they display that. So that's the problem, that anytime you try to take it away, then you arouse.
But like with the example of the Parthenon marbles, if they hadn't been removed by the British, then they would have been destroyed by the pollution.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I guess someone said something.
No, I didn't mean to cut in, sorry.
No, that's all
Richard,
right.
the discussion before here answers some of my query, I suppose, with the Bull Cave,
Oh, yeah.
where that art was practically obliterated
Yep,
by these, or whatever you call them.
Yeah.
Would they have ever attempt to restitute that and say, well, this is not appropriate? There is an image there which is worthwhile.
yeah.
And would they ever restitute that, do you think?
Yeah, well, that's like the Bunjil's Cave. When you look at older pictures, you see similar kinds of graffiti around. But luckily, they didn't do anything to the actual Bunjil figure. And they did remove a lot of it, you know, by using whatever you use. But some of those paints, you know, modern paints are really hard to get off. And so what they did, as I mentioned, was just to overpaint it with black paint, which doesn't look very nice. And also they inadvertently painted over some Aboriginal paintings.
I was going to say, Richard, I know this is so sacrilegious and you want to save this art, but when you showed that picture with the graffiti, I just thought if you take it to a time frame in the future, you're going to have people saying, well, this is one culture and this is, you know, it's later.
Oh, yeah. You can even say that there's some spiritual thing that makes people want to put their own things there. If you want to, you know, of course, you don't want to say it because it's too positive somehow, but it's true. Yeah.
Yes.
I just wonder whether a way of safeguarding those special sites like the Duramara and the Bunjil's Cave lies in something that is allowed in the town of Stawell, however Victorians say it, Stawell, S-T-A-W-E-L-L. About a kilometre out of town, there's an outcrop of fantastic rocks, and huge, you know, sort of practically ceiling height here, big boulders, and probably there was some Aboriginal art on them. It's only about 10 kilometres away from Bunjil's Cave. But somebody started the trend of painting, graffiti, doing their names, doing symbols, whatever, on these huge, beautiful rocks, and the council has allowed it. So maybe what you do is you set up a sort of false site. But here's something that you can vandalize. It's big and splendid, gorgeous rocks, and go for it, and then they don't go out to Bunjil's Cave. I don't know. We read about Sisters Rocks, and we went there thinking to be called Sisters Rocks, there may be some significance. Maybe it was a place that was special for women.
Yeah, someone actually said that, you know.
I think
Someone said that, and they said there were paintings there.
That's what they're long since gone. But there is just local acceptance. That's
But you
what
see
the
things
Greens do.
like it seems like really lowbrow art, but there's like a peace sign up there.
Yeah.
You know, this is young people expressing what kind of feels important to them. You know, it's kind of,
This is the only place I've ever seen like it anywhere, where it is not encouraged, but it is locally accepted. People go there and they paint whatever they want to paint on there. Their names, you know, in big letters
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Except in Melbourne, these lanes whereby graffiti is allowed, but it's good graffiti. It's nice. It's art.
Yeah, like that's some really good art.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So you said something about the different images that were there and archetypes and not represent, but is there also something in the way you talked about the meaning about the story that is within that, or the story even within the story, or the meta story as you connect it with other components of the life of people there, and how it might relate to typical inter-Aboriginal artworks, where to find the water.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's the kind of interpretations that specialists will give. They'll say, "Oh, this is hunting, like fertility and more animals and things like that." There's that kind of interpretation, but it
is
is
a story in terms of a lesson.
Yeah, yes, but it is always a kind of, I don't want to say yes exactly, but it can't come from any actual person, because that thread is broken between those who knew what it meant and us.
Did you have something like, the Mahabharata, which is like the story?
Yep.
Within the story, there's a story within the story. Within that, there's another story. But the whole thing has a story as well. And so you have, and it was originally a completely oral tradition, and it was kept as an oral tradition, so that it could adapt to the time. When it became crystallized, not being written down, then it, of course,
Well,
it fails to be representative.
well, as Jane mentioned, I did go on this linguistic expedition in the 70s to the Simpson Desert with Mick McLean Arangeli and Dr. Herkus, whom I mentioned. And the thing that really impressed me about that was both Louise Herkus, she was a very fluent speaker of Kangaroo, and Mick was one of the last 4 speakers of that language, and he was the last initiated man. He of course couldn't tell anyone who wasn't also initiated in his level, but he decided to tell these things in his own language to Louise, even though she was a woman, and of course not initiated. And so that's something that sometimes someone who's at the end of the tradition might do. Now, those things that he told her are now preserved on tape at the Institute of Aboriginal Studies. But Louise died 2 years ago.
What are their sense?
Well, I haven't because they're in Kangaroo, and can anyone? I don't know. In order to read them or to listen to them, hear them, understand, you have to know Kangaroo, and then you have to learn Kangaroo. Can anyone learn Kangaroo now from just the materials?
That's like saying you can't actually read the Quran unless you know Arabic. I mean, they say they're quite distinctly, it's not translated. So why are these things mystified, or why? Is there a reason for that?
Or just the fact that, as someone mentioned, there's been a cultural genocide in the area. So, I mean, it was very disturbing to be there with Mick, and Mick was born in the 1880s, before there was any European settlement or contact. And it was really sad to see the Aboriginal people now in towns like Cooperbeedy. You see that that's just what's happened to that culture.
I kind of also wonder this desire to know this secret, whether it's other mysteries, not just Indigenous, but the secret mysteries, wanting to know it. And it's kind of like, leave it. You can't know it. You're not immersed in this. You haven't.
That's the mystery, is the mystery.
Yeah. Well,
people kind of think that they're going to hear this thing and then suddenly going to be like, oh, bang. And it's like, just leave it.
Well, I'm sure other people here have the same experience. My father was a Mason, and my father very much wanted me to join the Demolay group, which was the boys' Mason group. And I wasn't at all. Yeah, there was a Eastern Star was for women, and the Masons were for men, and the Demolay group was for boys. And he wanted me to go into that. And of course, Masons have these interesting outfits they put on, and they have initiations, you know. But unfortunately, that tradition ended because I wasn't even slightly interested. But it's kind of parallel to an Aboriginal group where you're initiated to higher and higher understanding, but then you can't pass it on maybe if the person isn't interested.
It's a very big theme in Jungian traditions that there was a secret wisdom in ancient society which can be somehow restored through analysis, and but the ability to get access to those sorts of initiatory traditions, as you're saying, is very broken.
Yeah, yeah, it
We
is.
saw, we saw walking through a show about walking through tracks through England, you know, and you come to these kind of druid sites and stuff, and people go there and they leave things and they light fires, you know, there's remnants of people, you know, tying ribbons around the trees and that, and you know, I've got a friend who's, you know, Wicca, but it's a broken, there's not a link.
No, there's not a link. There's not a druid. No.
Except the
It's all made up.
with the Seven Sisters dreaming of the songlines, where the ladies from Central Australia brought their art to the National Museum here in Canberra, because and what part of the issue was that the trauma in the local community made it impossible for them to keep their processes of secret tradition alive without divulging them to the broader community. And so that songlines story of the movement of the Seven Sisters all the way across Australia is a living tradition, but very fragile.
Yeah. Well, that's similarly in Alice Springs. There, his name has escaped me. Maybe someone will remind me. Famous anthropologist who, his father was a missionary at Hermannsburg, I think, and Strelo. There was he gathered. You know, he spoke natively, I think, Aranda, and he gathered together chiringas and other sacred objects, and they're in Alice Springs in a museum, but you can't see them unless you're initiated. So there's that solution. So it's kind of a secret bank for people who are qualified to see it. So there's that. Yep.
In the Dandenongs, there is an area dedicated to this character called Billy Ricketts, who was in Alice Springs. They call him Brother Billy, the Aborigines do. And he made sculptures there, and he was doing that, maybe he's died by now, in the Dandenongs, and you see these Aboriginal figures in clay on rocks. Beautiful stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not traditional Aboriginal style, maybe, but he tries to portray the people he identifies with there.
Yeah.
And it's accessible for anyone to see that. And if you swat away the mosquitoes in that sort of Dandenong here.
Yeah, that's in the Dandenongs.
In the Dandenongs, yes.
Yeah. Well, there's, when you speak of those figures, in Howard, the Howard book, you know, of the first contact things, he mentions that it was a tradition to make clay figures of people like spirits like Bunjil, and to use them in initiation ceremonies, to make them underground. But of course, they didn't last. So, yeah, there was that tradition.
Yeah. And I've got a rock with two figures like that because Billy Ricketts was very sick at the time, a long time ago in Alice Springs, and I bought it. So I've got that unusual little rock with
see that
the two clay figures. Yeah.
I should mention before I quit, I know it's time to stop, but there is also European rock art at Iron Cove, Roselle. It's the separate next after Roselle. Roselle, yeah. And there's an old mental hospital, and on the foreshore, there's a Callan Park. There's a series of rock art of ships. It isn't Aboriginal, although there is some Aboriginal art there too. But it was done by a mysterious man who evidently lived in a boat on Iron Cove and look at these rock sculptures, which are interesting to see. So, and that should be preserved too. So, you know, part of the history.
Richard, one of the things that Carl Jung was interested in is cultural syncretism, and you know, the whole question of how in mythology you see the interaction between different cultures. And I mean, one of the things about Aboriginal culture is that through the whole colonial period, it was pretty intensely despised by the white society, but over recent decades, that attitude has been changing, and there's much more of a sense of respect for Indigenous culture. And yeah, I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about that in terms of the sort of syncretic spirituality in Australia.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important aspect to looking at Aboriginal art, because I think, to me anyway, it does resonate in that way. And I'm sure there is a growing body of people who feel that way and who see it, you know, not as their art or their culture, but our art and our culture, because it is, you know. And Jung would tell you that, I guess, that, you know, we can feel in that art the power of it without knowing the mythology that went behind it, but we can feel the archetype.
So Jung had a really strong interest in the sort of neo-pagan movement, and so that there was a lot of debate between the sort of civilized Christian superego and the sort of naturalistic paganism of the id, if you can put it in that sort of terms. And so just looking at the authenticity of so-called primitive art, and I mean, that was a big movement with modern art, with painters like Picasso, just you know, respecting African art, but then you get the whole sort of cultural appropriation debate coming up.
Yes, yeah, that's I think that's quite sad actually, because I don't think it's stealing another culture, but it's participating.
Or honouring it.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, I mean, I'm interested too in things like in the European Australian tradition, paintings like the Dowling painting of the widow and the two horses and the Aboriginal man. It just so reeks of something archetypal, to me anyway. So, and yet it doesn't really matter what the story behind Jane Scales and Jimmy is. It's just that you can feel that, and that's what I think Aboriginal art is like too.
Ask a question. Maybe somebody here could answer. I'm struck by the number of Aboriginal engravings of a shark, a whale, giant fish with something inside it. Now, all right, I don't know when the huge Australian wombats or the other megafauna went extinct, but I've never heard of any engravings or paintings, let's say, of a giant wombat with a person in his belly.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether, say, in Africa, have there been paintings, rock engravings of lions with somebody
I don't know.
in the belly? Or what is it about the fish? I mean, one thing is it's a super shape, it's a gorgeous shape, and maybe artistic satisfaction might enter in to doing a shark with somebody inside it, even if you did have the experience of a giant wombat eating your grandmother, you might not be able to perhaps execute it with the pecking stone. But does anybody know, are there traditions of other animals being portrayed or stories told about, the small deer or the woman from the village that they had in their bellies?
I don't know.
No?
There's just, as I mentioned, the Vishnu figure
Yes.
You know, there's a fish
With
and there's Vishnu.
gaping mouth and Vishnu coming out of it.
Yeah.
Yes, but yes, and yet it's a very common theme in Australian Aboriginal art. Was it something about people's experience that in fact being eaten by sharks was very common?
Well, it's an elemental thing that a fish is something from the depths of the unconscious. You know?
Is it something about the archetype of the fish?
Just quite simply, what is the symbolism of, you know, something in the depths of water, you know, that
Makes it so special.
to be, yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Isn't it the elemental unconscious that engulfs you?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the whale or the shark or the fish is symbolic of the depths of
That's
the water.
it seems to me anyway. What does anyone know about Jonah? What kind of writing there is in Christian thought about Jonah and the fish? And it's in the Quran too. Yunus, the same story in the Quran. Yeah.
I guess also, I don't know if this would be the same with big land mammals, but they would have hunted and caught them and cut them open and found the stingrays and the fish in the gut of them.
Yeah.
You know.
And they might have got the lion and found the little boy from the village that he did.
Well, they
Would have been harder.
they would have hunted lions, would they?
Except the Messiah is supposed to kill a
But I'm
lion.
just saying that they're not successful. You hunt herbivores, don't you, not carnivores, to eat.
No, it's a revenge or to stop a predatory animal that was killing people from the village.
And then cut open its gut and find what it had eaten. The baby. A dingo soup. Sorry.
Well, that brings up something that you're born from your mother's womb, and and those figures are sort of born from the fish.
Sorry?
Well, when you mentioned the woman pregnancy, you think that you're born, the person in the fish is being born from the womb of that creature, you could say. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know. Yeah.
I suppose there's something about fish swallowing something whole.
Yeah.
And land animals don't do that. They chew them first.
Except for snakes, of course.
Except for
Snakes
snakes.
do. Yeah.
Snakes do. But has there been any symbols of snakes with
Oh,
big...
I was trying to think, does anyone know? I don't know of any symbol of a snake swallowing a person. But I know you can cut snakes open and you can find mice and things.
Yeah. So I think that's the difference between land animals and these fish, the big fish.
Yeah, land animals digest it.
That swallow it whole, yes.
Yeah.
I think there are instances of the snake.
Yeah.
When I was doing shamanism, that we were taught as a thing of going through initiation to be reborn.
Yeah.
The symbology was the snake swallowing you, and you
Oh, yeah.
extruded out
Okay.
the anus
Yeah.
of the snake. And
Yeah.
that was, and the guy who did all that worked with Aboriginal elders, so he would have got it from them.
Yeah.
Because the snake he was using animals that were Australian
Yeah.
before.
Yeah.
But there's no carvings of snakes.
Well, I don't know that, but there definitely is that
Uh-huh.
symbolic.
Yeah, there are rainbow serpent carvings, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Rainbow
but
serpents,
just
yeah.
like snake.
But they're snakes rather than great pythons.
Well, they're really long.
Yes.
Well, probably we should, if there's no more, we should probably, I think we have to vacate this place.
You all get nightmares now.
Yeah, well, I'll
Being
get
swallowed.
being
Robert.
swallowed by a python. Jean, do you think we should close down?
Yes.
Thank you, Richard.
Oh.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are you, will the impact expedition go ahead? Richard, you think?
Look, I hope that when it opens up, I desperately hope the art wasn't damaged by the fire.
Probably
They
next
said on
year.
the news today that it wasn't.
Good.
It was.
Was.
It was not damaged.
But there's a lot of work's been going on around it.
Because I think they probably have to rebuild the wooden platform around it. That's probably what's taking the time.
I'd like to say thank you to Richard for coming out and braving the weather and whatever, and braving the viruses and one thing and another. And to say it's just been fabulous tonight. Thank you very much. There's a tiny little token gesture of appreciation
Thank you very much.
for you.
Thank you.
And also I'd like to draw your attention to October is Dr. Sarah